Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Lisi Schröttner, and I'm one of the pastors here. There are new faces in the crowd, so I can introduce myself again. But it's good to be with you this morning. And I want to say at first, thanks, Sue, for reading both of the scriptures for us this morning and the beautiful texts. I especially like the words from Isaiah that you read and how the Inclusive Bible renders that important passage from Isaiah 42. God has created us, and we embody justice and compassion and freedom for those around us. I love that in this interpretation, this rendering, the words are directed at the reader, at the listener. They're directed towards you, towards us. You are the one in whom God delights. Yes, you. This is what God has called you, has called us to. Well, this week I've been thinking a lot about this story, these 5 sisters, the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. And I've been thinking throughout the week of what other stories of women standing up and speaking out for others. And there are countless stories. So I just chose one. Well, when I was in college, I spent my entire 3rd year in Indonesia with MCC, taking part in their Serving and Learning Together program, their SALT program. And I've shared with many of you here how much I enjoyed that year and how much I learned and gained from that year away. Obviously, I learned a lot about the Indonesian culture, and I had wonderful host parents and a host church community that showed me so many things, took me so many places to share their culture. I also learned a lot for the first time, really, about global Anabaptism and what the gospel means in that context. And in the spring of that year, so it was 2013, I learned about a woman named Radeng Ajeng Kartini. Some of you may be familiar with this name, and she is a major historical figure. Kartini was born, as you can see, at the end of the 19th century, during Dutch rule, to a noble family. Her father was an important man and worked with the Dutch authorities, and her life was marked by a bit of privilege in her context on the island of Java. She learned Dutch early on and had pen pals and friends, Dutch friends as well. And she adopted many European ways. But her family was also deeply traditional in the Javanese culture, and when she reached puberty, she went into a period of seclusion, as it was called, and she stayed at home, besides going to school, until the time she was married. This was traditional. And she pushed back against this. She didn't want to stay at home. She wanted to see the world. She had learned so much already from her friendships and the world that even her family was part of. So she pushed back. And she pushed for women's freedom and education. And most of what we know about her is through her letters that she wrote to friends. And those were published after her death. One of her famous saying is "aku mau," which means "I want to" or "I want," and it's this expression of going for what she wants, and she wanted a lot for her and her people, and she fought for it. And as you can see, she lived a very short life. She was only 25 years old when she died after the birth, a couple days after the birth of her first son, her son. And after her death, Kartini schools for girls were established and became a national hero during Indonesia's own independence movement later in the 20th century. So there's a lot to celebrate here. National Kartini Day was established on April 21st, which is her birthday, and it's a big deal. And when I was there were celebrations all around in the community, in the schools, and in the church as well. And here I am celebrating Kartini Day with my friends. The older woman there is my host mother, and I got to wear traditional clothing. At another event, I got to put the traditional bun on my head, which looked very awkward because my hair was brown and the hair was black. So it just was this very awkward looking thing on my head. But there were many events that we got to celebrate as the women's Bible study, as the whole church. And I really quite enjoyed it. But, and here comes the but. So Kartini's story and her legacy are complicated. Yes, she fought for women's rights in Indonesia and in her writings, and she appeared to push back against Dutch colonial rule, but not completely. She embraced elements of colonialism, and she longed for her people to be free and educated and trained in the civilized ways of the Europeans. Critics refer to this as imperial feminism, which kind of misses the mark of a truly, fully liberating movement. So it's complicated. Was Cartini part of a colonial project that stopped short of full liberation for an oppressed people? Yeah. Did Cartini also challenge the system? Yes, she did. Did her legacy change the future for generations of girls to come? Yes, it did. Again, it's complicated. So, welcome, friends, to today's episode of Lizzie Ruin's Nice Stories. Here we are. So in today's story that we heard earlier, the ones who appear to challenge the system are the 5 fearless sisters, Mahla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, the daughters of Zelophehad. These 5 women demand their inheritance as Israelites. They know full well that the law, the Torah, stands between them and this inheritance, but they approach anyway. And the setting for this scene in Numbers 27 is quite extraordinary. So as the story goes, the people God goes with, the Israelites, are gathered for a census on the plains of Moab, just over here on the east side of the Dead Sea. They have been wandering in the desert for years and years, and we've arrived at a turning point in the book of Numbers. The first generation of Israelites, those who were rescued from slavery in Egypt, have passed away. Because of their disobedience, they would not live to see the land that is promised to them, nor would Moses, their leader, and Aaron, the high priest. At this point, Aaron has already passed away, and Moses is about to turn leadership over to Joshua. And at this point in Numbers, we've entered the so-called conquest phase of the journey. So the census isn't just to see who's made it through so far, but also it's to see who's able to fight against the people of the land. The census is also to see how much land will be allotted to each tribe at the end of their inevitable victory. As we see throughout the book of Numbers, land is a key theme of this book, Numbers, which presents an imagined past in which the life of faith is a rite of passage, which requires the Israelite people to follow God through the wilderness toward the goal of reaching the promised land. So this is a very important moment. And enter these 5 daughters, these 5 sisters. Again, in front of everyone, they approach the tent of meeting, approach all the important people with important jobs, Moses, Eleazar, the priest. The text implies that they came boldly, and I imagine they needed all the courage they could muster. Because they're women. Their father is dead. They have no brothers. Their mother isn't mentioned either, so we can assume she's also gone or she hasn't remarried. So the women are stuck. Here at the edge of a new land, will they continue to belong? What's going to happen to them? What will we do? Well, they approach with courage, and they assert their right to the tribe's inheritance. Moses, as we heard, brings this to God, who says yes, which is awesome. The story of the 5 sisters has been well studied over the centuries, and reasons for its inclusion in the Bible are varied. But scholars think that their story is a later addition to the Numbers narrative, because their case was an extraordinary one. A man dying without sons, right before land is parceled out. It's a bit of a conundrum there. As it was, there was no law dictating what was supposed to happen. So this is potentially one example of a story, a concrete example with names and people being added to help explain a certain law. This happens across the Bible, and it's not exclusive or not genuine to the Israelites and the Bible. It happens across cultures at that time. It's kind of like the writers go, what do we do here? What would happen if a man died and left no sons, only daughters? There's nothing written about it. Can we change the Torah? And the answer to that is yes. So they craft this story where Moses approaches God with this problem, this question, and God answers with a new law, a new Torah. And it fits very well. This little story falls in line with the main themes of the book of Numbers, as I said before, the inheritance of land and the life of faith. and that inextricable link between the two. In this case, the faith of the 5 sisters helps demonstrate that land, the land that God promises, remains in view and is within grasp. Remember, these women are part of the second generation of exiles, or those who have gone through the Exodus, who have been burdened for years and years with the stories of their forebears languishing in the desert and being kept from fulfilling God's dream for them. So hey, it's time for a new story where they will get what is promised to them and they will make it happen. Girl power, woo! It's the Spice Girls for you. So we could end it here. It's a great note to end on. Girl power. Things turn out just fine. But again, it's more complicated than that. So here comes the challenge. The 5 sisters know that they are part of this community, and they don't want their father's name to be lost simply because they're not men. So what's really at stake here? Oops, not that one. What's at stake? The woman's rights or their father's name? Women's rights or a family's right to land that was forcibly taken from people who already lived there? If that feels like a leading question, it is. I name these things not because I'm asking you to choose one or the other, a simple binary, women's rights on this side or a patriarchal colonial legacy on this side. I name them both because with ancient stories like this, there's usually more than one way to interpret it, and as history shows us, they have been interpreted in more than one way. The explanation for what's going on here is not A or B, but it's A and B, plus the messy middle in between, where other explanations are also valid. A story that looks simple on the surface is more likely more complicated, like the legacy of Kartini in Indonesia, and like 100 other stories and situations that I'm sure you can think of right now. So we have complicated stories, competing truths, and messy middles. This describes the Bible. The stories that we've inherited are complicated. They're written and compiled years and years, thousands of years ago, for a specific group, with specific theologies and, yes, agendas in mind. The translation, interpretation, history is messy, even within the biblical time, as we can see from the addition of stories like this into the broader narrative. So on the one hand, the fact that the names of these sisters show up 5 different times in the Bible is a thing to celebrate. The story of Numbers 27, when they first approach, is by far their strongest appearance, and matched closely later on by the story in Joshua 17, where they demand of Joshua that they get their inheritance that Moses promised them. And they get it. The land is theirs. But on the other hand, in the other places where their sisters are mentioned, their appearance is controlled by others in the story. They become passive rather than active participants. In Numbers 36, at the end of the book, these 5 sisters are at the mercy of the men who come complaining that these women might marry outside their tribe, therefore taking their land to another tribe and losing it for themselves. Inconceivable. That can't happen. That's a quote from 1987 classic film, The Princess Bride. It can't be. We can't lose land that is supposed to be ours. So, at the end of Numbers 36, or in Numbers 36, time for a new law. Numbers 36, verses 6 to 7 reads, "Let them, these daughters, marry whom they think best, only it must be into a clan of their father's tribe that they are married, so that no inheritance of the Israelites shall be transferred from one tribe to another." The language has moved from centering the women and their demands back to centering the men. The focus shifts to their husbands, and the women are in the background again. So in the end, I have to say, it's still a man's world, and I feel like every time we're talking about the Old Testament in the Bible, I say that, and I am sorry, but it's inescapable. And there are other biases in the Bible, not just the patriarchal ones, that we can't escape. Like I said earlier, in the book of Numbers, inheritance of the land is a driving theme throughout the book and throughout the whole Exodus and wilderness narratives. So it's a driving theme, but it's also a bias of the writers, this inheritance, this promised land idea. That is in part why the conquest narratives exist, or why the entry into Canaan is framed as conquest. It is divinely sanctioned land from God. We know that these stories have been used to justify all kinds of religious domination around the world and throughout time. So then we have to ask, whose stories are we not hearing? Whose stories are hushed up or changed for the greater good of God's people? The indigenous people of the land? The women? The non-Israelites who married into the family of God? Oftentimes, these are the stories we're not hearing. Stories can be complex, multiple things true at once. The women were brave, yet the main concern of the story still seems to be the father's inheritance. God promised the land to the Israelites, yet it came at a cost, the displacement of others. People can be tools for empire in all its forms, even when what they're doing appears noble and just. So again, it's complicated, and we ask ourselves, what do we do with this? What then is the message? And I promise you, there is good news here. I'm just getting to it. When multiple things are true at once, how do we proceed? Can we still find encouragement and hope in this story, this message of the 5 sisters? Yes, we can. But I was pleased when in the Book of Belonging story, the word wrestle came up. When we wrestle with difficult texts like this, and I think we do have to wrestle with them, we are invited to view the story from different angles. So if you imagine yourself in a wrestling match, or if you need something a bit less competitive, maybe a game of Twister, think of all the different perspectives you get. Looking down, looking up, your body in weird contorted positions, perhaps. Can we turn the biblical text upside down and inside out? Can we view it from down below and on the margins? Can we view the text from way up high to get a bird's eye view to form a bigger picture? When we wrestle with a text, I believe God speaks and shows us which messages are most life-giving. And this is where we can employ different frameworks, different ways of seeing the Bible, like post-colonialism, which is something I was diving deep into this week, which is just a framework that changes our perspective, simply, from that of the colonizer to the colonized. Or can we employ theologies from outside our worldview, like liberation theology that was developed in South and Central America? Can we look at our siblings in the global South, or not even that far from here? Can we look at oppressed groups right here at home and learn how they read the scriptures? We really can learn a lot about boldness and humility. So with these perspectives, then, the message is to have courage and live justly. Live justly not only for yourself and for your inheritance, not just for the good of your people, but for the good of all people. The big invitation here is to stand up and speak for what is right and good. Sometimes systems, sometimes the law needs to change or be deconstructed completely before it's rebuilt. We can be part of that work, and honestly, I think the gospel compels us to be part of that work. The most compelling and life-giving liberation movements seek the good of all and work toward everyone's flourishing. For example, some of you may know the author, activist, and teacher Bell Hooks, and she was adamant throughout her life and throughout her work that, quote, feminism is for everybody. That's the title of one of her books. And she wrote again and again and again that to truly be a feminist or to truly work for liberation movements is to seek liberation for all. In this case, for men and women, not just women. This is another quote from Hooks. Feminist thinking teaches us all especially how to love justice and freedom in ways that foster and affirm life. When we look at the Bible, we have to ask these questions as well. What fosters and affirms life for everyone? Well, when the Bible was written, the authors had one community in mind, and it certainly wasn't us, Anabaptists here in Saskatoon in the 21st century. But I'll use a word that's come up already a few times. We've inherited these texts as those who follow, trust, and love God. The task of interpretation, then, what we do as a community, is to ask, how can our inheritance be a gift to all the world? We can ask, where do we need to stand up and speak out? Even when it's complicated, where is God calling us to stand and speak? Well, this morning we are wrapping up this part of our journey through the Book of Belonging in the section that we've called Foundations, the beginning of the story of the people God goes with. And I want to conclude with a few words from the story that's actually following ours, which is taken from Deuteronomy 1 to 32. Really, it's a big summary of a big book. But it's called Remember to Remember, and it's the story as they enter this promised land, what God commands them, what God asks of them to do as they are blessing the world around them. And again, with conquest, with genocide, it's complicated. But these are the themes that come up again and again in the book. And the authors of this Bible, this storybook Bible, they summarize Deuteronomy in 3 sentences, and I thought they were fitting for how we'll end today. The first is remember where you came from. Throughout Deuteronomy, God, through Moses, reminds them again and again, remember where you came from. You were once enslaved, and now it is your job to help free other people. Remember where you came from. And secondly, remember who belongs in the middle. Don't forget the foreigners. Don't forget the children without parents, the orphans, and the widows. Nobody should be without belonging. And I love this. Don't push them to the outside of the group. Put them right in the middle, like they're covered in a hug. Isn't that nice? More than nice. That is powerful. Let's put the marginalized away from the margins into the middle, where they are loved and protected, where they belong. And then thirdly, remember where you're going. God's people had always been heading towards the promised land, and they were wandering for years and years. But remember that God is doing a new thing, as we heard from the prophet Isaiah. So I'll end with these words. When you've had so much time in the wilderness, close to God and far from anything and anyone else, Moses said as he sent them forth into the new land, now it's time to go and choose God. Now it's time to go and bless everyone else. You will feel fear. When you feel fear, remember. You will feel lost. When you feel lost, remember. You will feel shame. When you feel shame, remember. God's love stretches in both directions, into all your yesterdays and all your tomorrows. God is the same, and God will be with you wherever you go. Remember to remember to remember. Amen.